I'm sorry. I'm going to start the intro again. Good evening and welcome to ArtScapades. Tonight's program, WPA Art, from the New Deal to Community Art Projects, is very dear to our hearts here at the Norwalk Public Library. Back in April 1986, the city of Norwalk awarded Greenwood Studio the contract to remove 31 WPA murals from the walls of the old Norwalk High School. This was paid for by a grant from the General Services Administration in Washington, D.C. The contract specified that the murals be removed from the walls and stored in a safe manner until private funds could be raised for their restoration. There was extensive damage to most of the murals. Ralph Bloom, Norwalk City historian, and he's a library board member and volunteer here. And his committee, he and his committee worked through this process. Through their efforts, private and corporate funds were raised and used to restore these murals. In 2001, the Norwalk Transit District published a book entitled Norwalk's Collection of WPA Era Art, commissioned for public buildings, 1935 to 1941, to celebrate the city of Norwalk's 350th anniversary, documenting these works. I don't know if you can see it, but this is the book. So today, I'm sorry. So today we're pleased to present Robin Hoffman to discuss the WPA art. In this lecture, ArtScapades looks at the three American Impressionists, John Henry Twachtman, Julian Alden Weir, and Childe Hassam, who were working in the Connecticut area leading up to the period of FDR's presidency, and then look at 5 WPA artists whose works were installed in the local area: Arthur G. Hull, Robert Pallison, John Stewart Curry, George Evison, and Alexander J. Rumler. So please join me in welcoming Robin and Jody here today.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen since I'm going to be the one lecturing. One second. Okay, is that coming up? It doesn't look like it's correct. Jody, is it right?
Sorry, no, Robin.
No.
I've
Okay.
got your notes.
Never mind. I'm gonna go back and share it again. Hold on a second. Something messed up.
You want to share a portion?
Yeah, no, I got that part. It's somehow. Not sharing the right part of it. Let me see if this.
No, you're still on the wrong thing.
Is that?
You're off center.
Off center.
Your box isn't around just the screen you're sharing.
Is that better?
Better. Let me see. Yeah.
Okay. That should be right. Sorry about that.
Okay. No problem.
Okay. Welcome. Thank you, Cindy and Norwalk Library, for having us back. I'd also like to thank Jody for being on with us tonight. Creating these lectures is always a team effort. Jody will be watching the chat box as we go along. So if you have any questions and you want to put them in there, Jody can either answer them up, as we go along, or we'll answer them at the end. So let's get started. In this lecture, we are going to be looking at what was happening in the local art world before and after the Great Depression. French Impressionism was happening across the pond. in America, artists adopted the style, and American Impressionism became the dominant style of American art. Now, at the height of the Great Depression, American regionalists embraced subjects of the heartland, and these artists celebrated familiar subjects in ways that were very accessible to the general public. The Ashcan School was a loosely knit group of artists based in New York City, and what they did is they believed really in the worthiness of immigrant and working class life as artistic subject matter, and in an art that depicted the real rather than an elitist ideal. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt enacted the first of his New Deal programs, including the first federal art program. And federal art programs remained in place until 1943. And as you can see, the period of WPA art overlapped with American regionalism. So we start with Impressionism and its move from France to America. So by 1885, hundreds of American artists had gone to Paris to work amongst the French Impressionists. Now, some of the American artists remained there, while others returned to the US, and they brought Impressionist thought and technique to the art schools and museums back here. Despite initial resistance in America to the Impressionist movement, influential dealers and collectors, as well as the artists themselves, were able to open up the market for this new style of art. And beginning in the 1860s, Paul Durand-Ruel was an important art advocate and a very successful French art dealer and gallery owner. In 1886, as the originators of the French Impressionist movement were holding their last organized group show in Paris, 310 works in oil and pastel by the French Impressionists were sent to New York City by the Durand-Ruel galleries, and bringing their work to New York helped to establish the popularity of Impressionist art in the US.
Robin, your
Yeah.
slides are being cut off at the top.
At the top, okay, let me just,
Yeah,
all right, thank you. Is that better?
yes.
Okay, perfect. By the 1890s, Impressionism was firmly established as a valid style of painting for American artists, and the work of the American Impressionists captured the countryside to which urbanites like themselves and their patrons had retreated. As in this painting by Frank Benson, they often depicted women and children in tranquil interiors and gardens that ignored or denied the industrialization taking place beyond their walls. So most of the repatriated American Impressionists, as you might know, lived in the Northeast, and they tapped into the cultural energy that was increasingly concentrated in New York.
You're actually still missing a little bit of the tops.
At the top, okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Just want to make sure it's back on there properly. How's that?
And that didn't change. Getting closer to the top.
Okay. Let's try on the next slide. There were artist colonies across the country, but today we concentrate on East Coast Impressionist artists who were active in art colonies that were located around Connecticut. The 10 American painters shown here, generally known as the 10, were influenced by Impressionism and began resigning from the Society of American Artists in late 1897 to protest the large size and commercialism of that group's exhibitions. And the 10 held annual exhibitions for 20 years. And eventually the group fell apart as their art was nudged out by urban realism and other movements which came to the public's attention. And tonight's discussion includes artists who were members of the 10. The first one that was circled back there was J. Alden Weir and Child Hassam, as well as John Twachtman, who died before this photo was taken and who we are going to start with. Let's see, is that showing the whole slide, Jody?
No, his name is being cut off at the top. And it's saying
Okay.
half of the line of John Twachtman.
Okay, is that up there? Because it's
Now
How's
it
that?
is. You got it.
All right, I'm going to go back a slide.
Go back
Hold on.
one.
Nope. Okay.
There you
all
go.
right.
You got the whole
Great.
thing now. Thank you.
Okay, John Henry Twachtman may well be the most gifted, original, and innovative of all the American Impressionists, but he is relatively unknown today. Only in recent years has this talented artist begun to receive the widespread recognition that he rightly deserves. So art historians consider Twachtman's style of American Impressionism to be among the more personal and experimental of his generation. Now, Twachtman was born not on the East Coast, but he was born on August 4th, 1853 in Cincinnati. And his first artistic efforts were painting floral window shades for his father's business during the day. And in the evening, he trained at the Ohio Mechanics Institute. In 1874, he studied at the Cincinnati School of Design before going the following year to Munich, where he studied at the Royal Academy. Now, Twachtman returned to Cincinnati, where he married Martha Scudder, who was an amateur artist, and they honeymooned in Europe, where he painted in Belgium and Holland with a new friend, artist J. Alden Weir, who we're going to talk about as well. So this springtime scene shows Martha and their children on a terrace bordered by flowers and bathed in a soft light. And Martha rocks her newborn son, interestingly named J. Alden Twachtman, while their daughters play by her side. And the Twachtmans went on to have a total of 7 children. Dissatisfied with his work and its public reception, and fed up in general with Cincinnati, Twachtman complained to Weir that, quote, a good many people, all of them supposed to be up on art matters, have seen my paintings, but I am convinced they care little for them. This is a very old fogied place. There is no good art influence here, and I shall be glad to leave. So we apologize if anybody is from Cincinnati, because he wasn't very nice about it. So opting once more for Europe, Twachtman studied for 2 years at the Académie Julian in Paris, determined to improve his drawing and further develop his style. And I'm just going to do that. Make sure I've got the bottom on there too. Okay. A series of personal, poetic French landscapes culminated in this serene and monumental painting, in which the elegant treatment of the reeds silhouetted in the foreground reflects the influence of Japanese prints. And as you may know, the French Impressionists collected Japanese art and were significantly influenced by it. If you have ever been to Monet's Giverny, you will know that his house is filled with Japanese prints. So awash in greens and very silvery tones, this large canvas was turned down by the Paris Salon, but has come to be the most admired of Twachtman's early paintings. And it was purchased in 1968 by the Met. Twachtman ended his studies in Paris and returned to America at the age of 32. And once home, he faced a period of significant economic hardship. He traveled widely looking for support, painted with Weir on his Connecticut farm, and even joined a crew to paint a large cyclorama in Chicago. Now, Twachtman eventually settled in Connecticut on 17 acres of land on Round Hill Road in Greenwich. And on the property was a farmhouse, which the Twachtmans steadily enlarged over the years. And here he continued to develop his own impressionist manner, and he painted the bulk of his work. And the majority of his finest works were completed during this period. In this work, Twachtman uses linear perspective to lead our eyes directly to the house. The land, the waterfall, brook, ponds, as well as the farmhouse would all be the subjects of many of Twachtman's best-known paintings. A few years back, the Bush Holly House actually did a focus on Twachtman, and there were even tours of his home. So we're sorry we missed it, but keep an eye out if that ever happens again. The change of seasons at Twachtman's Greenwich home inspired some of his best-known Impressionist paintings. In Summer Trees, Twachtman used soft tonal qualities using broken brushwork, and this painting was done during what is considered Twachtman's Greenwich period, where he celebrated the natural beauty of his surroundings. Now, besides the farmhouse and the land surrounding it, Twachtman made dozens of paintings of this small waterfall on his property, and he emphasized the solidity and the rich colors of the surrounding rocks and the force of the flowing water with a broad, smoothly applied brushstrokes. And today, although additional houses have been built nearby, the waterfall looks much as it did when Twachtman immortalized it a century ago. Now, unlike other artists, such as his friends Childe Hassam and J. Alden Weir, Twachtman lived in Greenwich all year round, and he commuted to New York to teach at the Art Students League and at the Cooper Institute. In addition, he supported himself by working as an illustrator for Scribner's magazine and by teaching plein air painting at Newport and Coscob in the summers. Now, perhaps because of financial problems, Twachtman spent the winters of 1900 and 1901 at the Holly House, a boarding house frequented by artists and writers in Coscob, adjacent to Greenwich. And here is an early ad for the Holly boarding house from 1885, which includes offering large rooms, fresh vegetables, shade, 1 minute from boating, bathing, and fishing. And for artists desiring to leave their studios and paint en plein air, like some of the French were now doing, Coscob and the Holly House became the center for students seeking accommodations. At the Holly House, Twachtman socialized with artist friends like Haslam and Weir, and they engaged in spirited debates, charades, and games at night. And during the day, Twachtman diligently painted buildings around the village, and particularly the old house itself. As seen in this painting, Twachtman was especially fond of winter landscapes. He explained to a fellow artist, "We must have snow and lots of it. Never is nature more lovely than when it is snowing. Everything is so quiet and the whole earth seems wrapped in a mantle. All nature is hushed to silence." Now, Twachtman painted several different views from the front porch of Holly House looking across the Mianus River, a scene now marred by the jarring presence of an elevated span of I-95. He also created affectionate profiles of the house in all seasons. As we saw, Twachtman showed it covered in snow, and here in October, he depicted it along with the neighboring store surrounded by fall foliage. Now, the unifying factor in this painting is that all the colors are nearly the same value. It appears to have been painted during the brightest part of the day so that the colors seem washed out or faded. Now, today, the structure is known, as you probably know, as the Bush Holly Historic Site, and it is open to the public, filled with works of art and memorabilia of the Coscob Art Colony. It is well worth a visit. Around the turn of the century, Twachtman began summering in the picturesque fishing village of Gloucester, Massachusetts, and produced a series of vibrant scenes that anticipated a more modernist style that had yet to gain prominence in American art. Just after his 49th birthday, as his art seemed to be taking off in new and very promising directions, Twachtman died suddenly of a brain aneurysm in Gloucester in the summer of 1902, and he was buried under a simple headstone in Gloucester's Oak Grove Cemetery. Now, we've mentioned Twachtman's friendship with J. Alden Weir, including that he named one of his sons J. Alden, and J. Alden Weir is the second artist we're going to be talking about tonight. The 14th of 16 children, Julian Alden Weir, known as J. Alden, was born on August 30th in 1852 at West Point, New York. And from the very beginning, Weir showed an interest in art, one that was not surprising given that many of his fellow family members were artists. His father, a prominent painter of portraits and historical subjects, was professor of drawing at the U.S. Military Academy. His older brother, John Ferguson Weir, was a well-known painter and appointed as the first director of the Yale School of Fine Arts in 1869. Now, Weir's family offered him encouragement in his own career as a painter, and at age 17, he enrolled first in art classes at the National Academy of Design, and then from 1873 to 1877, he studied in Europe, mainly in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. And he was sent off with the blessing of his father, who told him, "Don't return, old boy, until your veins flow with the rich mother's milk of art. Fatten on it, and then let your own genius ripen with the experience of it." Weir's 4 years in Europe were exactly the intense experience with art his father wanted for his son. Weir studied art, and he traveled extensively and wrote to his brother, "A man could afford to starve for the sake of seeing these great wonders." This painting is an early work by Weir, which he painted in the fall of 1876 after returning to Paris from a trip to Spain. And this scene shows people gathering at a water fountain to exchange news and take a rest from their daily chores, and would have been a common sight in Spain at that time, as indoor plumbing was not yet widespread. When Weir left Paris in 1877, he returned to New York City and established himself as a portrait and still life painter and began teaching at the Art Students League. He also helped to found the 10 American Painters, the group formed to exhibit their own work separate from the rigid standards of the Academy. Now, Weir took on portrait commissions as a means of support, but there were few commissions to be had. As a consequence, he often used his own family as models, and here, Weir has balanced the two unequal figures of his wife and daughter by placing them in a triangular composition, and has used the guitar to follow the lines of the triangle and to visually separate the white of their two dresses. Idle Hours was completed in 1888 and exhibited that year in the 4th annual prize fund exhibition in New York, where it earned the $2,000 prize. Weir also took on the role of art buyer and collector and took trips to Europe partly to study and partly to buy art for New York collectors. And Weir bought a painting for $560. Irwin Davis, a New York art collector, took one look at the painting and offered Weir a 153-acre farm in the Branchville section of Western Connecticut in exchange. Weir liked the property and agreed to the trade. So in 1882, for a painting and $10, Weir received the Branchville farm. The identity of the painting that was traded for the property is unknown, and believe me, we have looked. The property was located on Nod Hill, and Weir and his artist friends nicknamed the property the Land of Nod and used the phrase to title works that were inspired by the local landscape. And from that swap was born the Weir Farm National Historic Site in Branchville on the Ridgefield-Wilton line. Weir Farm is the only historic site of its kind in the state and its only national park, and it became a cradle of American Impressionism. It was in this same year that Weir got married. One of Weir's pupils brought a friend with her to a drawing lesson. The new student was Anna Dwight Baker from Windham, Connecticut. And within 3 weeks, Weir and Anna fell in love and became engaged, and they were married in April of the following year. After a 6-month honeymoon in Europe, they returned to the US, and Weir made Branchville his primary residence for the next 36 years. He built a studio on the grounds and became a father to 3 daughters, Caroline, Dorothy, and Cora. But a week after Cora's birth, his wife, Anna, died suddenly. Shattered, Weir handled the tragedy by leaving Branchville and spending several months in Chicago, where he immersed himself in painting murals. Now, his wife's sister, Ella, was available to take charge of the children while Weir was away. Letters between Weir and his sister-in-law show his gradual realization that Ella could fill the void in his life, and they were married in Boston in October of 1893. This pastoral landscape reveals Weir at his most impressionistic. This painting appears at first glance to be a serene view of nature, but a red-orange accent in the center background brings the viewer's eye to a factory chimney. Its vertical form links it both to the trees and to the pole protruding from a haystack in the upper right, linking it to both nature and to agriculture. Between 1893 and 1897, Weir painted several views of the textile factories in Willimantic, Connecticut. And while it's not certain that this painting depicts Willimantic, it demonstrates the idealization of the New England factory village that is characteristic of those works. More than in any factory painting, here Weir softened the industrial reality by keeping it at a distance and linking it formally with the countryside. At a time when Americans worried that the price of industrial progress might be the loss of natural beauty and agrarian values, Weir painted visual reassurances that America could reconcile tradition and change. Here, Weir has chosen to show an even more formal interest in industrialization. This painting shows the image of a red iron bridge, which is reflected at the bottom in the water. The red of the bridge stands out against the delicate greens and blues of nature, and the red color marks the bridge as a symbol of technology that seems out of place. Now, Weir showed this painting at numerous exhibitions in the early 20th century, including the massive show of the 10 at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in 1908. And this painting remained in Weir's possession until at least 1910. It was not signed, though, until 1914, when it was presented to the Met, and is considered Weir's most famous work. Like Monet's beloved Giverny, Weir's farm was an enduring source of inspiration. He added a fishing pond in 1896, and in 1907, he acquired a neighboring farm, bringing his property to a total of 238 acres. Weir also expanded the original farmhouse twice, giving him more space to host his friends, and many artists spent weekends there, fishing, hunting, drinking homemade cider, discussing philosophy, and of course, painting. This work sums up Weir's mature approach to landscape painting, in which he used bold pictorial effects to capture both a visual impression and his intense feelings about nature. This painting is of the small village of Wyndham, where both of Weir's wives grew up. At the time it was done, Weir and many of his friends exhibited in the Armory Show of 1913, an international show of over 300 artists that boasted the largest attendance of an art exhibition in New York. Over 100,000 people attended and were introduced to new modern artists like Duchamp and Picasso. With the success of the show, Weir said that, quote, "These young artists are getting at the real thing. They are the ones to watch. Our work is a thing done." Now, Weir died from heart disease on December 8th, 1919, at the age of 67. And during his illness, Weir found comfort at his farm, where he would sit on the porch, observe the farm's natural beauty, and reflect on his full life. As Weir wrote, "Really, I know not what I am best at. I believe I am a fisherman, dreamer, and lover of nature. And if I live to 120, I might become an artist." Child Hassan was a pioneer of American Impressionism, a founding member of the 10 American Painters. Hassan was instrumental in promoting Impressionism to American collectors, dealers, and museums, and he became the foremost chronicler of New York City at the turn of the century. But he wasn't born there. Hassan was born in Dorchester, Massachusetts on October 17th, 1859, and his father was a cutlery merchant and took little notice of his son's budding artistic talent. But a fire in 1872 wiped out his father's business. To help out, Hassan dropped out of high school and took an accounting job. However, his poor aptitude for figures convinced his father to allow him to pursue an art career, and Hassan found employment with a wood engraver and proved to be a talented draftsman. By 1882, Hassan was exhibiting publicly and had his first solo exhibition of watercolors at the Williams and Everett Gallery in Boston. Having had relatively little formal art training, Hassan was advised by his friend and fellow Boston Art Club member Edmund Garrett to take a study trip with him to Europe during the summer of 1883. And this is one of the 67 watercolors Hassan did on his trip. And here we can clearly see the use of a vanishing point leading down the pathway, mirrored by the receding line of the fence. The line where the water meets the sidewalk divides the painting almost vertically in half, and the horizon again divides the painting horizontally in half. And these two lines lead our eyes around the canvas and draw it to the center as a focal point. And they also act to balance the composition. In 1884, Hassan married Kathleen Maud Doane, and they had no children. She was Hassan's model in a few of his paintings from the 1910s. Early in their marriage, they lived in Boston, where Hassan began painting cityscapes, this painting being one of his first. Despite the old-fashioned charm this painting presents to viewers today, in Hassan's time, this scene was distinctly modern. Hassan enhanced his impression of the fast pace of city life by using a perspective scheme in which the vertical lines of the fence, the lampposts, and the trees recede rapidly into the distance, coming closer and closer together. Now, Hassan contrasted the hurried movement left with the calm quiet of the snowy park on the right. In fact, if you look at each side of this painting separately, they could be two totally different works. So, wanting to continue his art education, Hassan decided to return for a second time to Paris in 1886 with his wife. There, Hassam studied at the Académie Julian, receiving instruction based on traditional figure drawing. And with this work, Hassam incorporated the Impressionist style he saw in Paris into his artistic vocabulary. Now, the Grand Prix was the final race in the spring season held at the Longchamp track in the Bois de Boulogne. And the Grand Prix signaled the closing of the society season before summer vacations. The brilliant sunlight and small shadows in Hassam's painting indicate a time shortly after noon, the hour that race goers came to the track. There, people like those Hassam depicts would spend the early afternoon picnicking, sipping champagne, eyeing one another's outfits, and placing their bets. And the races at Longchamp has earlier been portrayed by French impressionist Degas and Manet, who depicted the jockeys and spectators at the track. Now, the New Britain Museum's painting is closely related to a study of the same scene in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Done earlier, the Boston study is smaller in scale and more subdued in color. Hassam said that colleagues who had seen his study had urged him to paint it larger. "I hope I shall do it as well as the smaller one, which I thought was successful in some ways," he added. Hassam made few changes to the composition, but if you look at it, he really brightened the palette and he loosened his brushwork. And the carefully calculated result marked his first decisive foray into Impressionism. In Paris, the Hassams lived among the French and didn't really socialize with other American artists studying abroad. Hassam's first Parisian works were street and horse scenes, and he sent them back to Boston for sale, which, combined with older watercolors, provided them with sufficient income to sustain their stay abroad. The Hassams returned to America in 1889 and settled in New York City, then the art capital of the US, to get nearer to important artists, dealers, and collectors. From 1889 to 1895, Hassam worked in a studio at 95 Fifth Avenue, not far from Union Square, and this painting shows a view of the square from a high standpoint, looking south from the corner of 17th Street and Broadway. In the background, the Hotel Morton House is seen on the left, and across from it on the right is the domed building of the Domestic Sewing Machine Company, and barely visible between them is the spire of Grace Church at 10th Street. When Hassam painted this scene, the center of New York City was still south of 34th Street. Union Square Park was a destination for entertainment and shopping. The challenge for the urban impressionists was that activity in New York City moved very quickly, and getting down a complete impression in oil was next to impossible. To adapt to this, Hassam would find a suitable location, make sketches of the components of his planned painting. Then he would return to the studio to construct a total impression, which was in actuality a composite of smaller scenes. Hassam painted what struck his fancy from New York City to the Isles of Shoals off the coast of Maine. He worked and relaxed on an island called Appledore, a popular gathering place for artists, and he stayed with his friend, the poet Celia Thaxter, who helped her family manage a hotel there. And social life on the island revolved around her salon. Artists displayed their work there and were exposed to wealthy buyers that were staying on the island. And Hassam often painted the garden that Thaxter had planted outside her cottage. She had deliberately designed her garden to look as if it grew wild by the sea. And the flowers here include red poppies, blue larkspur, white lilies, and purple hollyhocks. This is a close-up, and the flowers cover most of the canvas, and past them is the brilliant blue ocean, sun-drenched rocks, and a pale summer sky. Hassam had his first major one-man exhibition in 1896 featuring over 200 works. The New York Times observed that of the steadily increasing band of impressionists, Mr. Hassam is a priest high in the councils. Still, Hassam realized less than $50 per painting. Other American artists were also having a difficult time during the general economic slump of 1896, and Hassam decided to leave the depressing scene behind, and he and his wife returned to Europe. They arrived in Paris in the spring and then traveled on to England before returning to the US. Back in New York in 1897, that was when Hassam took part in forming the 10, the group that we discussed earlier, and he was among the most radical of its members. During continued trips up and down the East Coast, Hassan was a frequent visitor to Greenwich. He boarded at the Bush Holly House in Coscob, and this painting was done during his stay there. He has used short, choppy brushstrokes that go in every direction, and the result is that the air sparkles and the water appears to flow. Up the coast in Old Lyme, Hassan would often stay at Florence Griswold's boarding house, home of the Lyme Art Colony and now the Florence Griswold Museum. His charm and his easy manner made him a favorite of Miss Florence, as Griswold was affectionately known. And there, Hassan painted some of his most charming depictions of the churches, homes, and tree-lined streets of an old New England village, as well as many landscapes of the surrounding area. When looking at this painting, one is reminded of childhood memories of lying on the grass and staring at the sky, letting the mind wander while the clouds take on different shapes. And here, a large cloud resembling a mythical dragon, or at least that's what Hassan saw, it dominates the scene. As the new century began, some 3 decades after the Impressionists' first exhibitions in France, Impressionism finally gained a legitimacy in the American art community, and Hassan began to sell to major museums and receive jury awards and medals. By 1909, Hassan was enjoying great success, now earning as much as $6,000 per painting. And the Hassans returned to Paris in 1910, but found that it had changed. Hassan had left New York because he felt that the urbanization and industrialization there had tainted the city's visual and personal appeal. He now also saw Paris as a noisy, dirty city with too much new construction taking place, tarnishing its old nature. Hassan painted this work, a depiction of Paris covered in flags for the 14th of July, or Bastille Day, which, as you know, is a celebration of the beginning of the French Revolution. And even though he had become exasperated with Paris, Hassan was still able to be inspired by the many flags hanging from Parisian buildings in a patriotic display. And shortly after this painting was completed, the Hassans returned to New York. Hassan then began a series of window paintings, which he continued until the 1920s. Here, the model was the daughter of Toby, who owned Toby's Tavern next to the Bush Holly House. And the kimono she's wearing may have been a studio prop of Hassan's, for other figures in this series wear similar robes. The robe reflects the general taste of the time for Oriental elegance, when women dressed up in kimonos, practiced flower arranging, and participated in tea ceremonies. Hassan painted the last of the window series around 1920, and the scenes had become an important source of income and critical acclaim for him, winning prizes and selling quickly. Quite a number of them popular with museums, so you may have seen a few in your museum travels. The most distinctive and famous works of Hassan's later life compose a set of about 30 paintings known as the Flag series, which he began in 1916. And Hassan's flag paintings cover all seasons and various weather and light conditions. Now, he had hoped that the entire series would sell as a war memorial set, but the paintings were actually sold individually after several group exhibitions. Hassan was inspired by a preparedness parade for the American involvement in World War I. It was held on Fifth Avenue, which had been renamed the Avenue of the Allies, and thousands participated in these parades, which often lasted for over 12 hours. And this painting depicts part of the most ambitious flag display in support of the Fourth Liberty Loan Drive. These colorful flags were meant to encourage patriotic spirit and raise money to pay for wartime expenses. And here, Hassan looked north from 53rd Street and transformed 3 city blocks of flags into a colorful pattern. In 1919, Hassan and his wife purchased a house in East Hampton and made it their summer headquarters. There, he was very productive, and he returned to New York with a large group of paintings ready for sale. And Hassan devoted the last decade of his life largely to printmaking. Here, massive elms cast looming vein-like shadows onto the late 18th century manor house, named for a distinguished early settler of East Hampton. The post-war art market boomed in the 1920s, and Hassan commanded escalating prices, though some critics thought he had become static and repetitive, as American art had begun to move on to the Ashcan School and artists like Edward Hopper. Hassan died in East Hampton on August 27, 1935, at the age of 75. He had created more than 2,000 oils, watercolors, pastels, and illustrations, and after 1912, more than 400 etchings and other prints. Shortly before his death, he arranged to bequeath all the paintings remaining in his studio to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And according to his wish, they were sold to establish a fund for the purchase of American works to be donated to museums. So many American artists worked in the Impressionist style into the 1920s, but innovation had long since waned. By 1910, the less genteel approach of urban realists known as the Ashcan School had emerged. Not an organized group, the Ashcan School truthfully portrayed the seedier side of the city. Robert Henry, the most well-known of the Ashcan artists, wanted art to be akin to journalism. In his words, to paint to be as real as mud, as the clods of horseshit and snow that froze on Broadway in the winter. And this Ashcan painting was used by the US Postal Service to commemorate the movement in 1998. In 1913, the immense display of avant-garde European art at the Armory Show made even the Ashcan School seem old-fashioned. However, in the aftermath of World War I, many American artists rejected the modern trends that emerged from the show. American regionalism, with roots in the Hudson River School in the 1860s, is often considered a reactionary movement that was a rejection of the European modern art of Picasso, Matisse, and Duchamp, among others. Regionalism was seen as a reaction against the modern European style in an attempt to define a uniquely American style of art. And when the stock market crashed, America and the rest of the industrialized world spiraled downward into the Great Depression, the deepest and longest lasting economic downturn in the history of the Western industrialized world up to that time. And the nation was totally unprepared for the crash. For the most part, banks were unregulated and they were uninsured. The government offered no insurance or compensation for the unemployed. So when people stopped earning, they stopped spending, and the consumer economy ground to a halt. An ordinary recession, it became the Great Depression, and it was the defining event of the 1930s. Following his election as president in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt worked hard to counteract the effects of the Depression. In this photograph, we see Roosevelt during one of his famous fireside chats, where he would use radio addresses to explain his New Deal policies directly to the public. The Federal Art Project was a New Deal program to fund the visual arts in the United States. As part of it, the Works Progress Administration, known as the WPA, was created to promote the arts through the creation of major public art projects. Between 1935 and 1941, one of the goals of the WPA was to put unemployed artists back to work. Under this program, public buildings and parks across the country were the recipients of 2,566 murals and 17,744 pieces of sculpture. WPA murals can be found in virtually every state in the Union, and fortunately, many of these murals survive today. This area of Connecticut has one of the largest surviving collections of WPA murals. Produced for its public schools, libraries, and post offices, most of the area's WPA paintings depict everyday life in Fairfield County during the late 1930s and capture the spirit of country towns and small cities recovering from the Great Depression. And we'll be talking briefly about 5 WPA artists that did work in this area, as Cindy mentioned. So we begin with Arthur Gibson Hull, and Hull was born in Pennsylvania in 1881 to parents who were Presbyterian missionaries. Hull spent the first 12 years of his life in India and then spent many years moving from state to state in the US. After his father's death, he moved with his mother and 2 brothers to the Midwest. And Hull first studied art at the School of Fine Arts in Colorado Springs and later took courses at the Art Students League in New York and Worcester College in Massachusetts. Hull spent several years as a commercial illustrator and joined the art staff of the Rocky Mountain News in Denver. He ultimately moved to Norwalk in the 1920s and set up his studio on East Avenue. And Hull began his work for the WPA in November 1935 and created 7 murals and 4 easel works, and the mural panels covered a variety of subjects, including the age of chivalry, which he is seen painting here. The exotic surroundings Hull grew up in are reflected in these 5 murals that portray the voyages of Marco Polo. They were painted for the teacher's dining room in Norwalk High School. Unlike the usual WPA artwork, which tended to be monotone and depressing, these murals are brighter in color. And in 1986, after more than 40 years on display, refurbishing began on all of Norwalk's WPA murals. Through a city-sponsored program called Adopt a Mural, these and others that were hung in the schools, including in student cafeterias, were clean spitballs, ketchup, and ballpoint pen. And after their restoration, they are now in the Norwalk Transit District facility, which is on Wilson Avenue, where the public is invited in to see them. Darienne's Town Hall contains a large collection of Hull's murals. If you haven't been to the auditorium there, you may want to stop in there as well. And if you have been, you may want to revisit. The murals, which cover the front, side, and back walls of the auditorium, show scenes from the early history of Darien. At the time these were painted, the town hall was the Darien High School. The 2 murals at the front of the room depict the Tory raid on the Middlesex Parish Meeting House during the American Revolution. The Tories had arrived the night before and waited until 2 p.m. on Sunday afternoon when the Reverend Moses Mather and his congregation were assembled. About 50 men were captured that day, including the minister. The story of Sally Dibble is one that appears in the First Congregational Church's history of the event. It is thought that this depiction refers to an account which says that several congregants escaped capture by hiding behind women's clothes. They had quite the large skirts back then. Around the perimeter of Darien's Town Hall's auditorium are murals by Hull depicting different aspects of colonial life. On this wall, we see scenes of early commerce. Well-dressed merchants are reviewing documents as a pair of yoked oxen is being prepared to drag off a boat. And the second mural shows Selleck's warehouse with boat building taking place nearby. Near the entry doors are more pastoral scenes of Native American village life, and Bowman returned from a hunt with a deer carcass in tow. On the other side of the door, a woman with a papoose on her back cooks over a fire. In a third, Native American women tan a deer hide and churn butter. In the final rear panel, a muscular Native American aims his bow and arrow into the air hunting waterfowl. The last wall shows 2 scenes of interior domestic life, one around the fireplace and the other around a spinning wheel. And Hull died in 1941 at the age of 62. Darien's Town Hall also contains murals by other artists. In the entrance hall, there are 3 murals by Robert Pallison. Pallison's first mural focuses on the shoreline of Darien, while the other 2 are of the King's Highway, this one from Stamford to Norwalk during colonial days, and the other one shows from Boston to New York in the 18th century. Pallison was a Darien resident, born in 1890, and a member of the Darien Guild of 7 Arts, which had been established in 1927. His studio was in a barn, which still stands behind the First Congregational Church. Although he was trained as an architect, Pallison was best known as a mural painter who designed and supervised the painting of murals for Macy's and for Gimbel's. And Pallison died in 1940 at the age of 50. More well-known than Hull and Pallison, painter, muralist, and illustrator John Stuart Curry is considered one of the 3 most important painters of the American regionalist movement, along with Thomas Hart Benton and Grant Wood. Curry was born in Kansas in 1897 and grew up on his family's farm. He attended the art institutes in both Kansas City and Chicago. And in 1926, Curry went to Paris for a year to further his art studies and returned to America penniless, settling in Westport, Connecticut with his wife, Clara. And he taught at Cooper Union and at the Art Students League. In August 1928, Curry painted this work, which was exhibited at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. It was praised by the New York Times and earned Curry the attention of Mrs. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. In 1931, she purchased this painting for the Whitney Museum of American Art, which helped to establish Curry as a major artist. Baptism in Kansas reflected the fanatical religious sects that held open-air baptisms. These popular religious groups were part of the scene of rural life that Curry had seen in Kansas. Now, Curry was asked to paint his first murals under the Federal Art Project in 1934 for placement in different states, and 2 are in Norwalk's collection. This mural depicts early colonial industries, including shipbuilding and farming. And this one shows the more modern local hat industry. During the period of the mural, hat manufacturing was a major industry in Norwalk. The hat industry was active here until the 1960s, and the American Hat Company was located on Grand Street. Curry's first wife died in 1932, and he remarried a couple of years later. With his second wife, Kathleen, he eventually moved back to Kansas and then to Wisconsin, where he died in 1946 of heart failure at the age of 49. Kathleen, who died in 2001, just 2 days before her 102nd birthday, left more than 900 of Curry's works to the Kansas State University's Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art. And the Beach Museum now owns more works by Curry than any other institution in the country. So if you're ever in Manhattan, Kansas, you can check it out. So our next artist is George Alfred Avison. Avison was actually born in Norwalk on May 6, 1885, and his father was a businessman and local politician, and the family lived at 158 Main Street. Avison had a natural talent for drawing. After graduating from Norwalk High School, he worked as a staff artist at an engraving house in Boston. In 1903, he moved to New York City to train under William Merritt Chase at the New York School of Art. He worked as a professional freelance artist, and his illustrations appeared in St. Nicholas Magazine, Youth's Companion, Boy's Life, American Girl, The Century, and Scribner's Magazine. Avison married in 1908, and he and his wife Edith moved to the Silvermine area, where he became a charter member of the Silvermine Guild of Artists. By 1916, the Avisons had moved to 43 Perry Avenue, where they raised 3 children, George, Mildred, and Alfred, who grew up to become a renowned Golden Age comic book artist. During the 1920s, Avison painted covers and illustrated stories for pulp magazines such as Short Stories, Blue Book, and West. And in the 1930s, he was hired for the WPA. Avison did 4 easel paintings for Norwalk High School depicting popular sports of the 1930s. And the painting depicting football is the only one that Avison put a title on. And have you noticed the use of the color red by Avison in each of these works? In baseball, red focuses our eyes on the catcher. In basketball, the 3 players in red form a triangle that focuses in on the action or the ball itself. In the football scene, the players in the red jerseys form a diagonal that leads to the player carrying the ball. And finally, in hockey, the defensemen in red carry the eye across the canvas. This mural depicts a scene which is taking place behind what is today the Rowayton Market, and shows the important role of ships in transporting goods during the mid-19th century. And The Duke versus the King depicts Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. During World War II, Avison illustrated 3 books for Macmillan: Uncle Sam's Army, Uncle Sam's Navy, and Uncle Sam's Marines. After the war, he moved from Silvermine to nearby New Canaan, where he painted watercolor landscapes for fine art galleries, and he died at the age of 85 on May 30th, 1970. Our final artist, Alex Rumler, was born in Dubuque, Iowa. He was the second of 8 children born to German immigrants. At the age of 21, Rumler left Iowa with $100 from his father to go to New York to study at the Art Students League. In his late 30s, already married and successful as a commercial artist, Rumler moved with his wife Maria and their children to Europe, where he continued his studies at the Académie Julian in Paris before they moved on to London. In 1908, back in America, the Rumlers moved to South Norwalk, and he established his studio there. Rumler achieved fame when his painting of the signing of the World War I armistice was displayed on billboards across the country. In 1936, Rumler, already 69 years old, received his WPA commission to create murals for the third floor cafeteria of the recently built Norwalk High School. When the school was transformed into the new City Hall in 1988, the majority of Rumler's murals were moved into the central atrium. And the above painting was a result of many requests by visitors to Mr. Rumler's studio for him to paint himself into a scene showing him at work. The painting in the background is Mopping for Starfish. Rumler signed it, marking that it was executed under the Federal Art Project. It is one of Rumler's 16 WPA murals depicting life in and around Norwalk, and is one of many that focused on Norwalk's busy oyster business. It shows the importance of removing starfish, the #1 enemy of oysters, from the oyster beds. As seen with Mopping for Starfish, Rumler was at his best depicting South Norwalk's oyster industry. Oyster farming in Norwalk peaked from the late 19th century to the early part of the 20th century. By 1880, Norwalk had the largest fleet of steam-powered oyster boats in the world. And today, oysters are still farmed in Norwalk, and you may be familiar with the Bloom Company that has been in business for 3 generations. Rumler in these murals shows his workers without the broad shoulders muscularity so popular in other workers' art of the era, but his strong diagonal composition and attention to the smallest details of the job create images of a vigorous fishery. Shucking oysters is one of Rumler's murals not in City Hall, but is displayed in the Maritime Aquarium on the first floor near the old oyster house. Aside from the oyster industry, Rumler depicted many popular spots and activities in Norwalk, including this one of Calf Pasture Beach. Rumler showed members of his family, including his wife, daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren, at a picnic on the beach. Rumler included in his murals a popular roadside stand known then as Scribner's, and we think the stand is still there as Hybeck's today. And he depicted the activities of the annual Danbury Fair that lasted 108 seasons and took place every October. The site, as we think most of you know, is now a busy shopping mall. Rumler originally designed this scene of the Norwalk River without a cutout for the clock, but he redesigned it when the builder of the Norwalk High School contributed a clock. The stanza beneath the clock is from Rumler's high school yearbook. In 1942, Rumler moved from South Norwalk to Stamford, where he died in 1959 at the age of 92. Of the 46 WPA murals and canvases in Norwalk, 22 of them were painted by Rumler. WPA murals are a national treasure of the US, and they stand as a reminder of a time in our country's history when dreams were not allowed to be destroyed by economic disaster. So, well, we hope you enjoyed this. If you would like a list of where some of the art in tonight's lecture can be seen within driving distance, please email us at info@artscapades.com. And remember to mention which lecture you're looking for. And this one was WPA art. We will be back on Wednesday, October 4th, with the 4 freedoms from Roosevelt to Rockwell. So let me stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions.
There were not a single question. Someone mentioned that they went to see the Twachtman exhibit after one of our last exhibits at the Holly House, and they thought the tour was well worth it. So
oh,
anybody
good.
can do that.
We hope that you'll get out and see some of the murals now, because as you could tell from where they're listed, the Transit Authority, the Maritime Center, the Norwalk City Hall, the Darien Town Hall, and even at the library in Norwalk, that one's in the children's room, right, Cindy? Yeah. There's some wonderful murals. We couldn't even cover them all. And unfortunately, a lot of the artists, there's not that much information on them like there is on, like a Rembrandt or something like that. We're lucky to have the information that we do have, and we only hope that the information will grow over time as people get more interested in the WPA art.
Someone's asking about the Red Bridge, and I think that was in the Weir painting.
That's a Metropolitan.
Sorry,
Are they asking where it is?
the bridge itself, we don't think exists anymore. The bridge, the painting of the red bridge is at the Met.
Yeah.
But the Red Iron Bridge, we don't believe is there anymore.
Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question? If not, we're very happy you came.
Mhm.
Thank you. This has been great.
Wonderful. Thanks for coming out on a summer evening. This was wonderful. Great fun. Thank you.
Bravo.
I like the
Bravo.
clapping. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Local, nothing like a local art historian.
Yes,
All right.
it's
All
nice
right.
to look at things nearby. It really is.
Yeah,
And,
we're excited for the one in October too, because that one really looks at, it follows on from this one quite well, because it's FDR and the New Deal and how Norman Rockwell fits in with all that. So that's an
Right.
exciting one too. And really does dovetail very well with this one. So thank you, Cindy, for
funny.
organizing those two together. I mean, together, October, but that's not
Great
far
job.
off.
Great job.
Thank you so much.
I know we hate to say it, but we're all going to turn around and it's going to be October before
I
we know
know,
it.
I
exactly.
know.
So enjoy what's left of summer, everyone.
Nice
Thank
to see everybody.
Perfect.
Thank
Good
you so
night.
much.
Wonderful.
Thank
I've
you,
joined you from
Cindy.
Oakland, California.